Hello, everyone. This is Daniel Giamario for my monthly new moon video blog. And I have a number of topics for today. And both of the main topics are of considerable personal interest to me. The topics will include the Saturn Return point, 59 years since the Kennedy assassination, November 22nd. I like to honor November 22nd as a remembrance of that event, which I want to discuss here. And then also something that I came upon way back in 1990, which is actually going to happen again at the next full moon, which is called the Festival of the Red Swords. So there's a number of things that I'm going to go through here, and we can actually just start with looking at, since these video blogs happen at the time of the new moon, let's just quickly look at the chart of the new moon, and then we can go into the significance of November 22nd. I'm here today assisted with the slide presentation by Owen, our managing director. And here we go. Here's the topic page here: Turning of the Ages Mystery School, the Astrological and World Events of this Lunation, the JFK assassination, second Saturn return, Mars occultation, and the Festival of the Red Swords. I have a lot to share about the Mars occultation also. And let's take a look at the new moon chart. So what's interesting here, and there'll be certain similar themes that are going to come up in the course of this conversation, is that you can see Mars at 21 Gemini, and actually Mars will be in Gemini for a good 7 months. I wrote up something on that a couple of months ago. You can also notice here at the new moon, we have it in early Sagittarius, and Venus and Mercury in Sagittarius are holding court on the other side of the sun. So both of them are in the underworld. And we've discussed that in some depth at other times. You'll also notice that Jupiter is back at those latter degrees of Pisces, and will soon be going back into Aries. And notice that Chiron is 12 Aries. Some of these topics will weave through the conversation as we go through the material today. Also, please do note here that the nodal axis, as it will do whenever we're in the vicinity of an eclipse season, remains at that 13th degree of Taurus Scorpio. And remember that pretty much everything that I'm sharing here is within that same context of that 93-year synodic return of the nodal axis, similar to 1929, as I've discussed before. So that's the background of this lunation. Let's dive in by looking at the November 22nd, 1963 chart. But this was very personal to me. I was 15 years old. I was a junior in high school, and I was living in Bangkok, Thailand. My dad was a military officer, and so I was going to an international school in Bangkok. And so basically this is one of the things that's been true in my life, which is a lot of the way I see the world does not come from a US-centric perspective of being only in the US, but having been pretty much a world traveler, starting with my being what's called a military brat. Anyway, we had, by being over in Thailand, just as the Vietnam War was ramping up, we experienced in Bangkok when the Prime Minister of Vietnam, Diem, was assassinated. This was just before he was going to be going into peace talks with the Viet Cong and ask the US advisors to leave. And that has now been seen through research to have been a CIA hit on Diem. But it was only like 3 weeks later that this event happened, and I like to think of it, and I'm not the only one who said this at all, the killing of the three kings. The three kings being first JFK, then then RFK Jr. and then of course Martin Luther King. This was a tremendously earth-shaking event that later generations can barely be aware. They can't. It's hard for them to be aware of just what a shock this was, and not just to the sensibility of the people who went through the experience of it to see like a public execution, but to the ramifications of it over time. And I'm wanting to look at this from the perspective of astrological cycles. You'll notice several things to notice here on this assassination chart. Saturn at 17 Aquarius, Moon at 11 Aquarius, the ascendant at 19 Aquarius. And that means that we're just completing now the window of initiation for the second Saturn return from the point of the initiation. I'm sorry, of the assassination. Also, whenever there is a second Saturn return, there's also in the vicinity of the second Saturn return a Jupiter return. And while you can see here that the 9th degree of Aries is the placement of Jupiter for the date of the assassination, that Jupiter had moved up to the 8th degree earlier in the year, but it will have its direct contact, the exact conjunction, coming up in early next year. So in a sense, this is the pattern that some people follow in their second Saturn return, where the Jupiter events follow the Saturn events. Now you might say, well, Saturn is, beyond 1718, but we have a 9-month window of initiation, and it's more like 10 because we would include the 19th degree of Aquarius, 20 minutes, as part of the overall Saturn cycle, which actually started back on February 7th, 2022. And so we're at the culmination event of the second Saturn return, but still in the window of initiation of the Jupiter return to the chart. From the perspective of an individual horoscope, Saturn returns are really important, of course. The second Saturn return, possibly even more, because there's also the Jupiter return at that time period. And if you look at that original signature, it also turns out to be rather close to the moon position of the US chart. And also the fact that the nodal axis is so directly connected to the US chart in many ways. So let's look at the US chart relative to this. So what I'm referencing here is the placement of the Aquarian placement, South Node at 6 Aquarius, and then the moon at 27 Aquarius. And then the clumping of planets on the US chart in Cancer, which is very much in alignment with the assassination chart. Now, of course, over the years, there has been a huge amount of work done on the Kennedy assassination. I mean, there's at last count, I think there was over 250 books written about it, including a lot of material that was released for the first time to the public maybe about 10 years ago. So we know way, way more about that time now. And it was my opinion here, anyone who still thinks that that was done by one person, the lone nut theory, they just haven't done their research. In fact, it was after Kennedy was killed that the CIA created the theme of conspiracy theorist. So anyone who questions a mainstream narrative is called that automatically. Those from our perspective back then, and to see what has unfolded on the planet up to this point, I like to look actually at what happened there with that Dallas public execution was actually a coup d'état. It's essentially in many ways the last genuine, somewhat free American president was JFK. And it turns out that some of the many reasons in my research has noted is because he was putting out incredible feelers of peace. You know, he was he had back channels with Khrushchev, he had back channels with Cuba. And this went against what the neocon, deep state, anti-Russian, anti-communist faction in the US wanted. It is also the case. So I just want to while we're on this particular subject, for those who are interested in doing some of the research and have an idea of where I'm coming from on this, by looking directly at the astrology here first, it all started with a book called The Secret Team. The CIA, its allies in control of the United States and the world, and it's written by Fletcher Prouty, who was the main advisor to in the movie JFK that came out 20, 30 years ago. Who was Fletcher Prouty? He was the chief of special operations for the Joint Chiefs of Staff under Kennedy. But since then, based on recent research, there's 3 other books I can suggest. Probably the very, very best of all of them is called JFK and the Unspeakable: Why He Died and Why It Matters, by James Douglas. And it actually has to do with the connection between Kennedy and the Christian monk Thomas Merton, and showing to what extent Kennedy had really changed his mind on so many different things, and he was becoming a peace candidate, actually. Other books that go into this in some depth is Speaking Truth in a Country of Lies by Edward Curtin. Excellent read. It can fill you in on a lot of things. And then probably the best of all that uncovers so many of the ingredients is, I wouldn't say I like it as much for the general public as the one called about the Unspeakable that I mentioned before. But it's a book called Twilight Language by Michael Hoffman. They all go into this and particularly unpack the idea behind the conspiracy theory low nut stuff, which is designed to distract people from looking more deeply into what really has taken place in this country. So I can understand here why this has been on my mind, and given that I go back that far, where it happened when I was a junior in high school, and then lived in college, and when I was in late high school and in college was when RFK and Martin Luther King were killed, and the events of the 1968. It was all during the Uranus-Pluto conjunction with Jupiter. A lot to unpack, and I've talked about that in some depth at other times. Going forward, I just want to briefly run through, kind of as a recap, the major events relative to the US chart over this next month, because it's packed with stuff I think we need to be aware of. So let's go to the next one you have there, Owen. So there is the often spoken of, everybody knows about this, the US Pluto return. Now, while this is not completing in this lunation, slightly after, it's happening December 28th, 2022, we are in that last portion of 3 exact conjunctions of Pluto to the US Pluto, and what will be included in the resources for this video blog will be, again, a link to all the different previous articles and videos I've done on the US chart. But if we just put our attention on Pluto, then of course, what is Pluto about? It's underworld, going into the hidden material and becoming aware of what it is, the revelation of secrets, but also the power that can come from what happens when one composts what needs to be composted. And when I say what needs, well, that isn't, what some human says needs to be composted. It's more of a universal will kind of thing, but it would also have to do with the Earth Mother herself. What is her opinion? The underworld? Our view of Pluto in the school is that Pluto is not some, one of the three brothers that Zeus allocated to the world in beginning of patriarchy, but in fact that Pluto is actually a feminine energy, but obviously it's the underworld goddesses, Ereshkigal, Kali, Durga, even elements of Shakti would have to do with that particular element of the sacred feminine. So we're trying, obviously, in our school, trying to move beyond the patriarchal hijack. So then we can go to the Neptune. Neptune turning direct December 3rd completes about 1 3/4 initiatory window of Neptune opposing the US Neptune. The US Neptune is really close to where that, in opposition to where that turning direct point is on December 3rd. And so it's not just the US being in a Pluto return, but also only the second Neptune opposition since its inception. So that's a really important point also for individual cycles for not just the US, but any of you out there that have been in Neptune cycles recently. That's a major turning point in the Neptune cycle, and this also illustrates or emphasizes, amplifies what had been discussed back in the earlier part of the year, which was the Jupiter-Neptune conjunction, which I theorized was a seed point for 155 years, actually. Jupiter in Pisces, and now Jupiter is still back in Pisces, and we have the end of the Neptune opposition on the US chart. Notice, remember again also about Mars and Gemini here as we go forward. So the next one to look at would be the second of the three Neptune, Mars square Neptune, and it's the only one retrograde. And there's some other astrologers that have done some really good work on this. So I'm not the only one talking about this, even in our own school. Eric Roth has written and produced some really good material about this. Actually, Eric and I are going to be doing a seminar coming up also around this time period regarding Jupiter in Aries, actually. And meanwhile, we also have our continuing series of seminars on the Mars cycle, of which there'll be a lot more of those next year. But here, what I'm wanting you to notice is the position of Neptune, which is almost precisely the US position. The US Neptune is 2225, so here we have Neptune at 2242. And then we have the square, you can see, with Mars at 22 Gemini. One of the things I noticed even before beginning this video blog today is that at the point when I'm doing this video blog, which is actually the 21st of November in US, Mars in its retrograde cycle is conjunct the US Mars. So over these 7 months, there's many times in the time period that Mars is in Gemini where it makes an exact conjunction with the US Mars. So this is emphasized strongly by the Neptune square Mars, which also, for those who, if we lose track of this, is also there on the natal chart of the US. That is to say, Neptune square Mars. And I've looked at this in some depth in previous articles and video blogs about how what it symbolizes are all the confusions around what I would call bifurcation. two-party system, team red, team blue, vaxxed, unvaxxed, basically, gender, the bifurcation, which is really major in the United States. And we have to remember that our founding fathers warned against the country becoming a two-party thing. But of course, it's just right on the chart. How could the U.S. have gotten out of it? If you look at that Gemini, Mars, and there. And so now we have the Neptune square and the Neptune opposition, Neptune square Mars, which is happening in the world right now, but which also is tremendously connected to what's happening to the U.S. chart during this final phase of the Pluto return and all the other amazing things that we've talked about before regarding the election and regarding the other phenomena that was happening, a total lunar eclipse and Venus in the underworld and so on, Mars retrograde, all of that particular time period. And then as I mentioned before, the 93-year cycle of the return of the nodal axis to the same general area at the same time of year. So there's that ingredient. So what's the next one we have there, Owen? Yeah, so now we want to jump up to this remarkable full moon. We're still within that larger eclipse window time period, not the eclipse season. We're past the eclipse season. So there's no lunar eclipse happening on this day. But there's something super important that is happening, particularly for Northern and Western Europe and the US, which is a fairly rare to be this long and spectacular occultation of the moon over Mars. And you can see why that's so, because there you see Mars at 16 Gemini, and you see the moon at 16 Gemini, and the sun down there at the, they're in 16 Sag. While we're looking at this configuration here right now, just take note of the fact that the great red star Aldebaran, during this time in the precessional history of the planet, it's at 10 Gemini. And then look down near the sun is the other bright red star, almost exactly in opposition, Antares. Keep that in mind as we go through this. Oh, and I'm thinking that since I'm bringing up the occultation here, before going into the Festival of the Red Swords, I want to go to the map, the two maps of the occultation path. So this shows the global view of where the occultation of Mars will be visible. Now, if you think about an occultation, I do not see why there would be less significance to the path that an occultation is visible with Mars as much as it would be with a solar eclipse, So here, it's just obviously Mars is much smaller. It's on the other side of the sun, but here we have the path, and it will be visible for about an hour. Actually, on the west coast of America, it's from 6:31 to 7:31 p.m. On the day of on the 8th. But notice where it will be visible in Northern Europe. There's the zone of transit of right where it starts, which is there where a lot of actions happening in the world right now. And then it goes through Northern Europe, Western Europe, and then crosses the Atlantic, goes over Greenland, and covers virtually the entirety. Actually, it looks like it does cover the entirety of Canada and almost all of the US. And I do consider this to be significant relative to all the other factors that are taking place during the time we're in right now. Not to speak of the fact that we are in, a central portion of the great turning of the ages, which I reference in other video blogs and other articles. It's kind of like the peak points of it seem to be the zone we're in now for a variety of reasons. Now let's take a more detailed look at the pathway across the United States and Canada. So if you're living anywhere in those states or those provinces of Canada or a certain portion of Mexico, you are going to get you're going to be able to see the whole thing. It's a pretty major event, actually, I believe, particularly considering the importance of the full moon day, more of which we're going to be getting to here shortly. We have provided for all of you who are listening to this handy dandy list of the timings by time zone in the US of when you can actually witness the moon covering Mars, creating an eclipse of Mars, right? This just as you can ceremonialize lunar and solar eclipses, I think in much the same way here. And there's a lot of things that we'll see that can be ceremonialized with this upcoming full moon. And so there you go. There's the timings. And I'm obviously not going to go through all of these timings. I did reference the West Coast just a few minutes ago. And you can see just, LA 6:30 to 7:30, and, it's a little bit different depending on where you are on the West Coast. Certainly Arizona, it's a really excellent condition for being able to witness this and to ceremonialize it. Now, just for a moment, I just go back to that full moon chart you had there, Owen. So it's not just any old full moon, not a lunar eclipse, not a lunar eclipse, not a solar eclipse, but an eclipse of Mars. The occultation of Mars, right at that, close to those key degrees that are in the 7-month time frame of Mars and Gemini. And I should also mention this is exactly the time frame where Mars is going direct, and it's also the time when Mars is closest and brightest in its 26-month synod. It's not the very brightest of all the Mars cycles, but it's still like closest and brightest. And what about this condition of being connected to Aldebaran and Antares? So now I want to tell you the other thing of great personal significance to me. I became aware of something called the Festival of the Red Swords. I can't even remember exactly how I first became aware of this, but I found out about it in 1990. And as I was discussing this with Owen before our call, before this class, or before this video blog, it hadn't completely sunk in that in 1990, I had not even begun to become aware of Mars and Venus synodic cycles. And yet it fits into this really quite a lot. So when I became aware of this thing called the Festival of the Red Swords. And this came from a work of this is one of the sources of the information. Chief Festival of the Druids by John Hugh Roberts. And what I did is that I took a group of people. We had about 25 or 30 people. In fact, who knows, maybe someone out there watching this will have been there. I can barely even remember who was actually there. I wish I had a list of that group. And I put together a group of people to go down to Point Sol, and it was a deserted beach that night. And we did a fire ceremony. We did a ceremony for the Festival of the Red Swords, and then we celebrated. Now, what in the world is the Festival of the Red Swords? This is, by the way, the document that I sent out at that time period and to create the group there for the Festival of the Red Swords. The thing that I'm trying to bring up here and trying to point us to is that there has not been a Festival of the Red Swords until this full moon, because the same conditions are being met again. And why don't we go to that stanza that is from the Druidic festival. What the Druidic festival, what they called it was the Covenant of Azatlan. And here were the criterion: when ruddy face Antares shall entertain the sun, and the sun is saluted by Aldebaran, and Nergal, Mars, is the guard at the door, the Druids and the Christians shall meet on the shore, foot to foot, knee to knee, breast to breast, embracing. Now, what this, according to this research anyway, is the oldest of the Druidic festivals. It goes back to the sinking of Atlantis, or if you're in North America, it was called the sinking of Lemuria. And when that was happening, the survivors went out to try to survive the deluge and the rising of the oceans and the weather and all the extreme things that were happening at that time and the breakup of that previous culture. And so what the Covenant of Azatlan was, obviously back then, 12,000 years ago, there would not have been Christians as we would know them today. But what it was doing was it was saying, we need to work together. You know, whatever it is, this major catastrophe, not even getting into, you know, who caused it, how it was, whether it was a natural cycle, you know, whether it was the wrong use of technology. I mean, there's so many different things about that. I mean, Edgar Cayce certainly thought it was because of the misuse of technology. You can go off on that and say, well, some of the characters that are potentially engaged in a global coup d'etat, at least a financial coup d'etat right now. I wrote about that in last month, that they probably were Atlanteans, if you want to look at it that way. You know, let's do it right this time, you know. Right meaning the dark side of it. Anyway, the Covenant of Azatlan through time is how we can work together and to be able to embrace, you know. So in the case of this document, it was actually at that time period when Celtic Christianity was merging the old Druidic traditions with the arrival of pre-Rome Christianity. And Celtic Christianity was really represented before the Romans and you know, the latter Christians came over, was a linking up of the different traditions. So I think that, and then if we say the Covenant of Azatlan, where does that come from? Well, one of the places where the survivors of the catastrophe went was Mexico. And actually, Azatlan is often used as the mythic name of the original homeland of the, you know, Toltecs and Aztecs and so on. So that was one of the places where the colonies were, and then also in, you know, Scotland, Ireland, you know, up there, and other parts, you know, Egypt and I would suggest other parts of the world, including like South America, you know, like in the area of Teotihuacan, not Teotihuacan, sorry, down there in Bolivia, Tiwanaku. And that's the whole other story we could tell at some point about those different colonies. But to me, I think the significance of this is very much that it's a covenant of cooperation, collaboration, of unification between disparate groups that work together to make it through disasters and cataclysms. So while we began our discussion here in this video blog by looking at the kind of the dark side relative to the killing of the three kings. What's really kind of interesting is that three king phenomena also shows up in the Druid documents here, which is that they're talking about how the three kings were the three stars of Orion. And so they were called upon for assistance and help in the covenant of Azatlan. And so here we have the three kings also referred to as RFK and JFK and Martin Luther King. So it's really a blast for the past for me, but then also recognizing that I didn't even know about the synodic cycle. So it turns out that in 1990, that the same situation was happening. There was not an occultation, but you have to go back 32 years in order to find the same conditions happening, where you have the very same sun-moon configuration near Antares and Aldebaran, with Mars at the door, with Mars, kind of witnessing the whole thing there with Aldebaran. Hopefully, a lot of you that are watching the sky have been watching how Mars has been just hanging out at the horns of the bull, just behind the horns of the bull in the sacred hoop of creation, in that portion of the night sky. And here we have, at the time of the coming full moon, we have the Mars position, the moon position, and Aldebaran, right in that zone, that's a very important portion of the night sky in the sacred hoop, just in between the Pleiades and the horns of the bull. And remember that Mars will be in Gemini, and you'll be able to see this in that vicinity of the bull constellation, for these next months to come, and also the last few months. Remembering also that this is when Mars is at its brightest, so that you'll be able to see Mars pretty bright, even with the full moon. And then to be able to see it disappear behind the moon for an hour, should be one of the more interesting of all events that you can actually experience in the night sky. So just for a moment, let's go back, and you can see how this go back to that quatrain, or those words about the criterion for the festival. When Antares entertains the sun conjunct Antares, and the sun is saluted by Aldebaran, and Nirgal the warrior is a guard at the door. Is the set of symbols very rarely that occur. In fact, in looking at the 20th century, the only other time other than 1990 that I saw it happen was in 1943. I did not see it in the earlier 15 or 17 or 32-year possibilities for the Mars synod. You have to go back another 47 years. So this is absolutely worthy of further research. I'm just incredibly thankful that I lived long enough to be able to remember about this 1990 event that was so incredible to work, and the fact that it's going to be happening again within this time frame of the great turning of the ages. So as I said, we began this conversation with looking at the necessity, I think, to remember what happened in 1963, November 22nd, and what a second Saturn return would be about. an opportunity to graduate to another level or to hit the same wall. And that's essentially what can happen in Saturn returns. You learn the lessons, you break through, or you graduate to the next level, or you end up, finding yourself in the same set of limitations and boundaries. And just another thought that I have on that is that with the Jupiter return part of it, I do find it interesting. The Jupiter, the most exact point of the Jupiter return to the assassination chart, which is happening next year, is happening at very much the same week as the ending of this long Saturn cycle to the US Aquarius moon. So both of those things will be happening in the same time frame. And I will actually, when we get closer to that time, be delving into that more of the finality, the final wave of the Jupiter return and its connection to the final portion of Saturn conjunct the US moon. All of these are issues that have gone into the previous research on the US chart and how we can orient ourselves to it. Last final thoughts on this would be remembering to that night, that early evening on the West Coast, create something where you have a bonfire, create something where you can celebrate the event of the covenant of Azatlan, where all the disparate groups and tribes would work together to build a new world that would have had to have happened after the events of the Younger Dryas and the end of the disasters that were happening during the 12,000 years ago time frame. So hopefully I've given you some stuff to work with here and to think about. Did you? I know that you're out there somewhere, Owen. Did you have anything you wanted to ask about before we complete in the chat?
Just find it so interesting that, and if you would elaborate at all on how you said that was actually a chief festival of the Druids, right? It was considered.
Well, that's the opinion of the writers of that book and where I got that material from. I would not consider myself as of all the things I've researched. I haven't researched all of the festivals of the Druids. I know what happened to the Druids. I know what their original mission and purpose was, which is to keep alive these kinds of traditions. I know how they were, destroyed. It was part of that overall predicament, we could say, of the Merlin, where you find yourself in that position where you're recognizing the magnificence and beauty of the earlier traditions and maintaining our connection to what went before, but at the same time being open to the new transmissions that are coming through. And it's very difficult to find something in the world quite as magnificent as that attempt that happened in Ireland to be able to merge together the best of the Druidic with the actual soulful and heartful and Piscean transmissions coming through the teachings of the Christ, and they kept that alive for a long. It's actually still in the landscape of Ireland. You can actually still feel into it in other parts of the remnants of the Celtic world. You can also find the similar thing actually in pre-contact Turtle Island, North America. I've spoken of this before in the book, the really remarkable book, The Dawn of Everything, that talks about the how more than any other place on the planet before European contact, that the tribes of North America were the best representation of all forms of freedom that we've known, so the current situation we find ourselves in is not an evolution. It's not a natural thing that we must reach, but actually previous humans had marvelous ways of collaborating and living together, and so I think this covenant of Azatlan and this festival really connects in with those ideas. Maybe so. Just another thought, Owen. Maybe it was the chief one because it's the one that went furthest back. Just a thought. All right. So just as as we wrap this up, a reminder here that this month's new moon call. And you may see this before that, but just to remember that it's open to everyone as a kind of as a year-end gift. You don't have to be a member for the members call, and that's coming up on the 23rd. So you're welcome to join in on that. And then coming up are 2 days of solstice seminars on the, I believe it's the 20th of December. The current newsletter the newsletter will go out in a couple of days. We'll have all the details on this. During the 20th and the 21st. The 20th is completely free to everyone, and that will be presented by Levi Banner, who I collaborated with on the creation of the new courses, who will be speaking into the main ingredients of this paradigm, this astrological paradigm. And the next day is our annual fundraiser, which will have a raffle this year. A lot of pretty good prizes we're going to give away. And that will be a way to just have some interaction with the raffle and meet the other members of our council. And then there will be what we do every year, where myself, together with Mary, will be presenting kind of a perspective, looking ahead to the main events of 2023. And the last thing just to mention on this would be that on the 27th, Anya, my old collaborator for the Renaissance of the Sacred, who I've known for like nearly 40 years now, we're going to be doing a bonus offering, which goes into more of the subject matter of, who are we and what in the world happened to global humanity, and looking at archaeology and looking at anthropology and looking at usually not mainstream history, but kind of alternative history, and also tuning in again to the sacred sites that we would go to every year, Ireland and Scotland and Wales and Lunation, which I think is a really good time to do that, because we're coming up to the lunar standstill season. Way more about that coming soon. So I think we're complete for today, and I hope you enjoyed this.